With how rapidly technology has evolved in relation to video games, it's natural to wonder what a game may have looked like if it were made with the seemingly limitless potential of technology today. A ton of games have been getting the remake or remaster treatment lately, usually met with a ton of praise from fans, myself included. You know, is it preying on my nostalgia and inherent want to go back to a simpler time before I had to worry about things like my general life goals and my career path? Yeah, but hey, at least the video game looks pretty, right? Don't get me wrong, both are fine, and whether you prefer remakes over remasters or vice versa, end of the day, they both serve the same purpose of reintroducing an old franchise into a modern audience. It's pretty interesting how we love to take games that are clearly limited by the technology of the time and bring them into the modern era with now infinite possibilities to work with. But the very idea of a remake and remaster brings up a very interesting point when we come to discussion around how we preserve video games for the future. Video game preservation is a topic that's slowly been gaining momentum, now with some arguing that remakes and remasters are crucial to preserving video games. Video game preservation though is a complex topic, but remakes and remasters are a big part of it. Generally though, remakes and remasters are considered a good thing. It's a chance for a game or even a game series to come back to the modern audience and find new life. Existing fans get to replay the game they love dearly, and new fans just get a new game. How good? However, the issue kind of arises when a remake or a remaster changes way too much from the original to the new that the original soul of the game just doesn't seem to be there anymore. Resident Evil 3 is a common example of a remake that just kind of missed the mark. While yes, it does look extraordinary and all pretty and everything like that, and if you look like Joe Valentine, please DM me on Twitter immediately, this is no longer a joke. Some of the core aspects that made Resident Evil 3 so good in the first place just don't seem to be here. Branching pathways just aren't here anymore, which removes a ton of replayability for the game. Locations got cut from the game, a ton of enemy types got removed as well. There were like 2 puzzles in the game, and they're insultingly easy, and Nemesis himself just feels like a glorified cutscene most of the time. I don't know how they did it, but they made the guy called Nemesis not feel like your nemesis. Capcom, it's in his fucking name. Even if you were playing the Resident Evil 3 remake as someone who's considered the target audience for the game, personally I still think the game falls flat in a lot of areas, trading meaningful gameplay for action set pieces that just account to holding forward, and the game overall just feeling a little too streamlined. The original soul of what made Resident Evil 3 so good just seems to be lost here. A lot of aspects from the original Resident Evil 3 just weren't maintained and they weren't carried over to the remake, and I think it really suffered because of that. Demon's Souls is another example of a remake that didn't maintain enough from the original going into the remake. When we're remaking games, yeah, I don't want it to be a one-for-one of the original, but there are some things you need to keep in mind when you're remaking a game, because maybe that's part of the reason why the game was so beloved to begin with. Some of the biggest things in the original Demon's Souls is tone and atmosphere. And funnily enough, tone and atmosphere are 2 of the biggest things gamers tend to take for granted. Most of the time, it's actually the huge part of the reason why you even like the game in the first place. Remakes and sometimes remasters seem to lose a lot of tone and character from the original to new purely for the sake of beautification. Reddit warriors can say it's blind nostalgia all you want, but sometimes directly comparing the original to the new can show you just how drastic these changes can be. The Demon's Souls remake has had a lot of character designs altered, one of which that's always at the center of discussion is the Fat Official. I don't fucking know how to say that. Has a fantastic video on how the Demon's Souls remake does not maintain the soul of the original. In talking about the Fat Official, he directly compares how the 2 designs convey drastically different tones and ideals about the character. In the original, the design personifies greed, as the fat in Fat Official represents growing fat with greed and exploitation of others for their own gain. They are draped in black and gold garb, conveying a regal aura, and the distinctive grey skin and permanent wicked grin help to further their representation of what greed does in the world of Boletaria. Compared to the remake where he just looks fucking gross. like for no reason. His stomach is always exposed, he's coated, and I mean fucking coated in boils and warts, and just looks like a dude I'd see at 2 AM in a 7-Eleven. He doesn't even have the damn grin anymore, that's like half his character. The designs are so drastically different, and because of that, they convey very different tones about the fat official. While the first is a regal man who's a greedy bastard and exploits others for personal gain, the other is just a fat disgusting pig you don't like looking at. In Ratatosko's video, he explains how the original director for Demon's Souls said that all designs are made with the idea of maintaining a level of elegance and refinement, and how the remake's new designs really don't maintain this philosophy at all. The designs weren't changed because they needed to be changed, but rather because the studio that handled the remake thought their designs were better. Ratatoska also draws attention to how subtle details and environmental storytelling elements were changed, seemingly for the sole reason of making things look pretty without understanding why they look like this to begin with. From Software developed the original, while the remake was done by Bluepoint Studios. And while a different studio tackling the remake isn't unheard of, Bluepoint Studios doesn't have the same philosophy remaking the game as From Software did in making the original. You might not even think about it too much, but even slight artistic changes can harm the tone and atmosphere that the original had. Things like the addition of overgrowth to Castle Boletaria clash with the story of the game, where the evil that has befallen the land has only happened recently by the time our player character arrives. This overgrowth, however, implies that it happened a long time ago, which it just hasn't. A ton of the architecture has been changed as well, and it all feels more reminiscent of either Dark Souls or Bloodborne than it does of Demon's Souls. The buildings are more ornate and decorative and feel more gothic rather than the harsh utilitarian or brutalist buildings of the original. Sure, they look pretty, but again, it's going against the original intent in favor of looks. I will not let any Redditors tell me that I am nitpicking and biased towards the original, because environmental storytelling is just as important as direct storytelling. Fuck Reddit! I fucking hate Reddit! There's no denying that the Demon's Souls remake is much better than the original in terms of visuals, but in terms of artistic direction and intent, it seems to have shed those things in favor of looks. I understand this is probably due to the fact that it was a PS5 launch title, so they needed to go all out, but sometimes less is more when it comes to your designs and what impact they leave on the player and what tone they convey to the world that player explores. Changing things just because you can without taking the original intent into account can totally ruin the tone and atmosphere of your game. So stop fucking complaining then? Okay? Just go play your original games and stop complaining on the internet like a goo goo gaga baby ass bitch? Well, that's the thing. Most times you can't. When the controversial remaster Grand Theft Auto Trilogy Definitive Edition released in 2021, it was poorly received because despite being a remaster, some of the models looked worse than what they did 20 years ago, and the game was nigh unplayable with all of its bugs and glitches. However, another aspect of its release was concerning people. Upon release, the original versions of these 3 games were delisted from all major storefronts, which was a catastrophically bad idea on Rockstar's part. With this news, audiences and game journalists alike stated that it was harmful towards media preservation. A common theme that pops up with remakes and remasters is that they can sometimes feel like they exist to erase the original. And in this case, that was actually it. That was exactly it. Rockstar tried to take away the original, the one you remember, and replace it with a product that just wasn't up to par. I understand why they did it, obviously. Of course they only wanted people to play the new version that they made, but it still didn't sit right with people. This is where remakes and remasters tie into the topic of video game preservation. Yeah, you remember this is like actually half the fucking video? Video game preservation is an extremely important topic because if we don't take it seriously, there are so many games out there that just risk being lost entirely because we're not preserving them. Like Donkey said in his video on remakes and remasters like forever ago, video games are treated like an extremely disposable media, which is disappointing as it acts like we can't analyze and learn things from older games, or that the art they are isn't worth analyzing because they don't look as good as games do today. The Mona Lisa is one of the most famous paintings of all time, and its craftsmanship and rich historical significance has given it that reputation of the most famous painting of all time. Even centuries on, thousands of people from all around the world travel to the Louvre where it resides today, just so they can say they saw a piece of history. Now imagine one day you go to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa and you don't see the Mona Lisa, you see the Mona Lisa Kiwami edition. And it's just like a Chris Chan-esque drawing of the Mona Lisa that someone thought was really cool, so therefore they replaced the original Mona Lisa with the new one. because the new one looked better to them, therefore it was better to them. You might be thinking, this guy's off his fucking meds, what the hell is he talking about? But replace the Mona Lisa with your favorite video game of all time, and then the Kiwami edition with a remake of that game that just doesn't feel the same, and you kinda get what I'm getting at, right? In a study done by the Video Game History Foundation and Software Preservation Network in 2023, it was found that nearly 87% of video games released before 2010 are at risk of just being lost entirely. This is due to a variety of factors, generally relating to how we just seem to not reissue older games on new systems and how volatile digital marketplaces can be. In this study, they found that only 12% of PlayStation 2 games are in release as of 2023, and only 5.8% of Game Boy games are in release too. These are really fucking low numbers, and it's sad, because imagine how many great games are lost purely because we're not preserving them appropriately. The games I've talked about today are a part of this conversation, as the original versions of the games they're being remade from have not been reissued on modern platforms at all. Resident Evil 3, the original one, is not purchasable on any storefront today. The only option you really have is the remake. Look, let me be clear. Resident Evil 3 Remake is a fine game. You can play it start to finish and it looks fantastic. It's a video game, right? But I'm not gonna lie, there's something charming and appealing of the original Resident Evil 3. A big thing for me personally with Resident Evil 3 is its use of fixed camera angles. And while they haven't used fixed camera angles in like fucking forever, they are still a core part of the identity of Resident Evil. I'd argue that the fixed camera angles are just as integral to Resident Evil's identity as the fucking zombies are. And while the remake is fine and all that, I can't help but wonder what it would have been like if it was just a little bit more true to form. Can we really say that a remake is preserving a video game if it isn't at all close to what the original was presented as? Furthermore, is a remaster preserving a video game if things like the tone, atmosphere, and lighting are changed to be different than what they were in the original? Short answer, no, not really. For me at least, preserving video games mean having them available to play as they were originally created. When we remake and remaster them, we change things about its original presentation, and therefore it's not really being preserved anymore per se. It's just being updated and fixed. While this is kind of the point of remakes and remasters, we can't really say it's preservation of the game. Unfortunately, preserving video games is way easier said than done. The easiest way to achieve true video game preservation is simply porting the original to modern systems. But this can take as much time and effort as it would just remaking the whole fucking thing. Modern hardware just really isn't compatible with older software. Okay, but imagine we do take the time to painstakingly port an older game to a modern system. Is that enough? Is the game now considered preserved? Once again, no, not really. While porting a game to the newest digital storefront is all well and good, this once more brings up an issue that's becoming more and more common. These storefronts eventually will just cease to exist. We've been seeing this happen more often now, and most recently the Wii U and 3DS eShops have been discontinued as of March 2023. This meant that any game or DLC that was only available on the eShop could no longer be purchased. Thankfully, a lot of people banded together to try and download these games as quickly as possible before it all went down. But if these dedicated fans didn't pull together to try and preserve these games, they genuinely would have just been lost. The only option people are really left to turn to is emulation, which isn't a rock solid solution to the problem. Emulating a video game does technically constitute as piracy, and no matter how many Reddit warriors want to sit there slamming their keyboards telling me, but it's actually a grey area, the game companies don't give a shit. There is nothing stopping them from shutting down your grey area with an iron fist called a fat fucking lawsuit. Even if it's for a game and console that came out like 15 years ago, and the only logical way to play it is by emulating it. They don't give a fuck. I brought this whole thing up with my de facto producer, my dad, and he said, well, it makes sense, remake the good games and who gives a shit about the other ones? If they're not good enough to be remade, who cares? And while I understand entirely what he meant, there's still value in older games with the original direction they were presented with. I mean, even if that direction and maybe even the overall game is bad, I still think there's something worth studying there for the modern day. Yakuza 1 for the PS2 when it released in the West in 2006 featured a hilariously bad English dub that was a result of trying way too hard to be cool and edgy and the actors being given poor direction. There are so many funny fucking lines you can take from this dub, and they're not even meant to be funny.
Go! Kill this arrogant motherfucker!
Excuse me.
Excuse you? No. Fuck you! Hey! Kill this dumb motherfucker!
Your mother is...
Shut the hell up. Don't you dare.
What, you think you're better than me? 10 years in the joint made you a fucking pussy!
And you know, the voice cast here is stacked as well. But the main issue was that the actors, for a third of the time, didn't even get to see what the cutscene they were voicing in looked like. They just had to guess the tone and pacing, and they would edit it afterwards to line up. This is why there were so many weird cuts and pauses mid-sentence. Add in just an overabundance of swearing to try and appear more mature, and it just really didn't land. Why do I bring this up? Well, one, it's fucking hilarious, and two, it's a really great lesson in making sure you give your actors proper direction and making sure that your localization teams have the proper methods and tools to localize your game. Even though the dub can kind of be detrimental to the experience at times, I still think the original Yakuza 1 has a lot of value in being analyzed and studied on why we don't skimp out when we're localizing our foreign games. But most people outside of the die-hard fan base for Yakuza don't even really know that this dub exists because they have Yakuza Kiwami there to replace it. You cannot buy the original version of Yakuza 1 with its English dub anywhere. At all. You just can't. It hasn't been put back up. You either have to dive into the world of secondhand vintage video game shopping, which has its own risks associated with it, or you turn to emulation, which is illegal. It's a lose-lose situation. It sucks because this lesson in giving your actors proper direction and making sure your localization teams actually know what they're doing can just be lost because we're not preserving the game that will teach us this. This is of course only one example, but there are tons of others out there on how we can learn from older games for the modern day. We can learn things like how to properly set up tone and atmosphere from older horror games who couldn't rely on fancy graphics to get their point across, rather clever execution and creative problem solving. We can learn how action-adventure games were able to build engaging worlds back then, and study how we can build upon this now. We can study a game's individual art direction and presentation, and see how this allowed a game to stand out amongst the crowd, and sometimes even still hold up today. While remaking or remastering a game is fine and can be pretty great financially, using them to preserve the game isn't the way to do it. As a personal anecdote, while I was making this video, I went back and watched my first 3 videos on the channel, and they fucking suck. Like, they're just bad. They're just bad. The pacing is all over the place, the writing is horrible, the jokes, they're just actually not funny, like, at all, and the editing is so subpar, like, I'm actually surprised they even got 10 views at all. I even heavily debated just removing the videos altogether, because they're just not aligning with the quality standard I'm trying to set going forward. But in watching these videos one last time, I realized that I can still learn from them in what not to do and how to improve for the future. Sure, they're bad, but they still have value in providing a lesson to me on how to improve my content further. If I delete these videos and I don't preserve them, then I don't have anything to go back and study and improve upon. They're just gone. There are so many philosophies and lessons and design ideas to learn from these older video games, but how can we learn from them if we're not preserving the games that teach us these things? Again, 87% of video games before 2010 are at risk of just being lost entirely. And in a way, we're at risk of losing history. Sure, some companies are now taking measures to try and preserve their video games, but what about games that don't have that luxury? I think the main point that I'm trying to make is that while remakes and remasters can be good fun, they're a part of a larger issue that needs to be addressed. It sounds ridiculous, alright, but video games have their own rich and dense history that deserves to be preserved and studied for the future. If we put it into a bit of perspective here, video games have only been around for 66 years, starting in 1958 with Tennis for Two. In less than a century, we are at risk of losing 87% of video game history. That's fucking crazy to think about, man. Damn. Remakes and remasters are being used as a way to preserve video games, but I don't think that's the way to do it. As we've discussed, remakes and remasters sometimes lose a core part of the identity that made the game so iconic to begin with, purely in favor of just looking prettier. Preserving video games is so much more than just remaking and remastering a game and popping it out into the PS5 storefront for $60 and calling it a day. It's about preserving the art and the ideas that the original was presented as. It's about preserving the history of the games as well, where we've come from and what we've done and how we can go further beyond that. By opting to use remakes and remasters as a form of video game preservation, we're opting to try and replace history rather than preserve it. If we're not preserving our history, we're not preserving our right to learn, grow, analyze, and become better than what we were before. Fucking filmed this video like 5 times. I swear to God, I'm gonna cry if it came out bad.